Well, good to see everyone. It's about that time. Maybe a minute past, but we can dive in. We got the great King Solomon today, one of the most complex figures in the Old Testament. So we'll dive in. But wanted to see if there are any questions or things to flag to begin with. None whatsoever. Okay. All right. Oh, but John has his hand up. Okay.
Yeah, Jim, it seems like this time is almost the peak of the civilization of the Jews, and yet it's also the most sinful time. The question is how they make their money to be so rich to build that temple.
Well, that part of the issue, and the book talked about this. This is a little blip. Israel sits between three great areas, between Mesopotamia and Egypt. And this is kind of the 1 century or so when Egypt is on the decline and Mesopotamia, which is Assyria, then later Babylon, then later Persia, is also on the decline. So there's a real power vacuum. And so they're able to step in and do that. Of course, one of the questions is, are the amounts inflated? Are they talking more symbolically about amounts of gold and riches? But even so, Solomon is still regarded as kind of the pinnacle of Jewish civilization. This is an amazing, amazing time. They do have trade. Israel is kind of like Lubbock, the hub city or the hub area. And so they trade with Arabia, they trade with Egypt, they trade with Mesopotamia, and caravans from one to the other all cross their area, which is why they're very strategic and very important. And so they're able to defeat all their enemies and really live high on the hog during this kind of brief blip. It's really is kind of an amazing time period for Israel. Never again will they be this large. The nation state today is much tinier than Solomon's kingdom is.
Yes.
Above.
Is it accurate to say it's the peak of Jewish civilization, or is it the peak of Hebrew civilization?
Judaism, as we understand it, is not really quite invented yet, and so Hebrew is probably a better bet, Bob. So that's a good reminder to us. Oh, Jake is there too. Good to see you, the Mazukos. How are you all? Well, good. Well, we will. Any other questions? Otherwise we'll dive in here. I'll put up the PowerPoint and we'll share the screen. Let's see. All right. So here we are, session 16. We're over the hump now. Hard to believe. So we're in the beginning of the book of First Kings, and a reminder. First Kings is part of the Deuteronomic history. We've talked about that some. We'll talk about it more today. A reminder, we've talked also about the book of Samuel and the book of Chronicles. In the Jewish Bible, they're one book each. In English Bibles, in Christian Bibles, they get split up into 2 books. So in the Jewish book, there is a book of Kings. We make it First and Second Kings. There's no break point in between First and Second Kings in a Jewish Bible. Ditto for Samuel. I mean, that was kind of an artificial division. When King Saul died and King David took over, they split the book there in Christian Bibles, but not so in Jewish Bibles. And I said last week, and we'll reiterate it this week, beginning with David, we start to have the monarchs showing up in the historical record. In David's case and in Solomon's case, they're not coming from contemporaneous sources. They are mentioned in later sources. But after Solomon's time, we'll start to have contemporaneous references to the Jewish people and Jewish kings. And so it'll really be easier and easier to kind of line up Old Testament events and history with the secular historical record. With Abraham, scholars make guesses. Is he 1800 BC? Is he 2000 BC? With Solomon and David, we're much more precise. And as we go on, it'll be even more and more precise as we get going. Later on, we'll be able to date one of the prophets to the day, not only to the year, but to the day that he gives his prophecies. But we'll get to that. That's after the exile. Also, the archaeological record of Solomon starts to show up. There are ruins out there. You may notice in the book that there was this diagram with some ruins. Well, that's because these ruins are attributable to Solomon's time. In fact, I have walked through the gate that's marked as Gate C, the gate at Megiddo, which is just across the Jezreel Valley from a town that was not there in Solomon's time, but became important later, the town of Nazareth. So that gate, the ruins are still there, and you can walk in. So more and more we'll start to have intersections between archaeology and history and the biblical record, which makes it kind of a fascinating switch from where we were before. Before we were kind of guessing. We'll actually start to hear Pharaoh's names mentioned. Before that, they just said Pharaoh. Which Pharaoh? Let's try to figure it out, and they're guesses scholars can make, but we'll start to hear Pharaoh's names coming up, and that makes it easier to line up as well. All right, we also said last time, this is the inflection point. When you do date David and Solomon, we can get fairly precise. David is the turn of the millennium, and Solomon follows him in the mid-900s BC or BCE. He and David actually overlapped. Solomon really probably started about 968 BC. He and David overlapped a little bit, but we'll get to that in just a bit. So far, so good? Well, the section today was the first 11 chapters of the book of First Kings, plus some Psalms. I'm going to tackle the Psalm parts and those issues a little more next time, I think. I wanted to focus more in on the First Kings part today. But we have in First Kings, the first 11 chapters, we get David's end and then the story of Solomon in these chapters. So first couple chapters, David's death and Solomon's rise. Chapters 3 to 10, we get narrations of the glories of Solomon's reign. And then in chapter 11, we hear about Solomon's apostasy and his death. And one of the interesting juxtapositions here is that contrast between the glories of Solomon and his apostasy. And when I was a kid, Solomon was always the Bible hero. He'd be in the Bible storybooks just like any other biblical figure. And he was always the wise King Solomon, the good King Solomon. Well, it's a little more complex picture than that in First Kings. There certainly are aspects of the wise King Solomon, but there are also real problems with him as well. You probably don't remember because you probably don't memorize my sermons, but 2 or 3 years ago, I guess it was 3 years ago, or 2.5 years ago probably, I preached about Solomon. I said I preached about contrasting two kings. There were two kings. One was this glorious, wonderful, amazing, wonderful king, and the other was this horrible, despotic king, and they were both named Solomon. It was the same guy, but there are two really distinct sides to who he was and what his kingship was all about. So we'll be diving into some of that today. Solomon's apostasy is one of the toughest things biblically to deal with. In fact, really, Solomon, if you graph Solomon, my movie image is Thelma and Louise driving over the cliff. It almost seems like Solomon is chugging along really well, and then chapter 11 goes screaming off and into the canyon, and a fiery flame out and crash and death and all that. It's not a violent death, but it is a death that he doesn't end well as far as the Bible is concerned. So one of the questions we have here with Solomon's apostasy and death is how you do graph it. There is traditionally this Thelma and Louise type of graph that Solomon chugs along, and then all of a sudden, screaming over the cliff. And if you look at writings from 19th century, 20th century, this is kind of the way they would graph Solomon. Scholars would graph Solomon. But there's been some pushback on this recently. And some scholars in this area have really suggested, nope, if you really pay attention to chapters 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, there's foreshadowing. There are clues. There are issues with Solomon even before he goes screaming off the cliff in chapter 11. And so perhaps the better graph, and I would agree with this, I think their scholarship, their arguments are compelling, is that instead of going well and then plummeting, there are some foreshadowing, some dips on the road before we get to the final cliffside Solomon. So all that goes to say that Solomon is one of the most difficult people to deal with in the Old Testament. We've got bad kings, we've got good kings. We've got good kings who make some temporary mistakes like King David and then get back on track. But there's nobody that matches Solomon in being so wonderful and so awful. It is a real strange juxtaposition, and that does make him really tough to deal with. And we'll deal with some of that. So any questions or thoughts before we dive a little further? Everybody's quiet this morning. Must be the high humidity or something just pressing in on us. I don't know. Okay. All righty. Well, as we said, we have this outline in these 11 chapters. It's a fairly simple outline. The first section is David's death and Solomon's rise. So David does carry over from the book of Samuel, Hebrew Bible, to the books of Samuel in the Christian Bible. We do get David's senescence, his old age, and we do get his death and Solomon's rise. So First Kings opens with this kind of pathetic picture of David. David's an old guy, and not only that, he's a cold guy. He just can't get warm. And so they have to have this beauty contest. They're looking for a beautiful virgin who will serve as David's bed warmer. Some beautiful girl who will sleep with the king at night and keep him warm. And they come up with a gal, one of the most difficult of biblical names, Abishag the Shunammite. So if you say that 73 times fast, Abishag the Shunammite becomes David's bed warmer and servant. But the text is very clear. It's nothing sexual about this. She is just there as an electric blanket, basically. It says point blank that he had no intimate relations with her. And so there's some subtext here, and I think we don't want to miss this subtext. So the subtext is David's old. He's not even able to maintain body temperature here anymore. And he's got this beautiful girl in his bed and not able to do anything with that. So really, as far as the text is concerned, what they're trying to hint at is David is not a virile, manly man anymore. And probably not even, we shouldn't even see a kingly king anymore. He's kind of lost potency in so many ways. And there is an idea, we think of, we have Queen Elizabeth on the throne, and she's a wonderful old lady, wonderful great grandmotherly type. Remember, think of Viking kings. I mean, Viking kings and warlords, they would get taken out when they got too old. If they got too old, the next guy wanting to take over, if the king can't defend himself, that's kind of it for the king and for his dynasty and for his life. And so, there's some of that here. David is able to keep alive. He's got enough of an entourage around him. He's got enough political structure around him that he's able to stay alive, and he's not being eliminated like many warlords and kings would have been back in that culture, back in that day. But he's not virile and potent in the same way that he was. So that leaves something of a little bit of a power vacuum. And the very next thing that happens is one of David's remaining sons. Remember, he had his oldest son, Amnon, and his son, Absalom. Absalom killed Amnon because Amnon raped David's daughter, Absalom's sister, Amnon's half-sister, Dinah. And so David's lost kind of the two heirs apparent, but the next kid in line is Adonijah, and Adonijah makes a play. He tries to proclaim himself as the heir apparent. He sets up this big banquet to kind of show himself as king. He starts judging cases, taking over kingly roles and all that. And it's such a bad thing that the very night that Adonijah is having this big party, over back in the palace, there's some other intrigue going on, and they decide we need to do something about this. And Bathsheba is a fascinating character at this point. Bathsheba in the book of Samuel is somebody who is not a player. I mean, she is dragged into David's palace. She's almost raped. But at this point, after being in the palace for decades, she is something of a stage mother. She's a power behind the throne in some ways. So she has really grown, if you will, or whether it's a positive thing or a negative thing, she is a power player at this point, and she wants to make sure her boy, her son, Solomon, is king, not Adonijah. And so she really heavily lobbies David, as does Prophet Nathan's involved in these discussions and all that. And so they kind of make a quick move. They appoint, they anoint, and they crown Solomon, basically, and send word to Adonijah's party while he's having this banquet to, almost proclaim himself as king. And the guests start dribbling out as soon as they hear word that David has thrown his weight behind son Solomon. So Adonijah's attempt to take over the throne ends badly for him. It will end even worse in a little bit. Then we get this scene of David giving these wonderful last instructions to his son. And this is son Solomon. What you expect of a godly king. Solomon, remain faithful to God. Well, Solomon won't, but David instructs him to. And the Deuteronomic history, the Deuteronomic playbook, if you remain faithful to God, God will bless you. If your descendants remain faithful to God, God will bless them. That's the playbook we need to run with. And David gives that advice to Solomon. Solomon, for the most part, won't heed it completely. He'll heed it some, but then give up on it later. His descendants will not heed it much at all, with a few notable exceptions. And so things will fall apart later on, which is what the Deuteronomic history wants us to see. If you're not faithful to God, things are not going to go well. But David is ending as a godly king. He had his problems in the middle. He made some mistakes, but he always got back on track with God. And so we have this wonderful farewell, godly admonition from King David. But at the same time, we get some other last-minute instructions to son Solomon. He says, by the way, General Joab's getting too big for his britches. After I die, take him out. You just need to kill him. He's going to be a danger to you if you let him live. He's causing more and more problems. I've lost control of him. Take him out. Also, when David was escaping from Jerusalem, there was a guy named Shimei that kind of cursed him and made fun of him. And David said, as long as I live, I'll let you live after he regained power. But he tells Solomon, I'm not going to be living much longer. So once I'm dead, take him out as well. And David dies, and Solomon does just this. He takes out those two. Plus, he also goes one further, and he takes out brother Adonijah as well. And the scenes, I mean, Joab runs to the sanctuary and grabs a hold of the horns of the altar and, claims sanctuary. And Solomon sends his guys in to kill him anyway. So it's pretty brutal. So we have kind of this bizarre juxtaposition between these godly admonitions and some real power politics, some vicious power politics. And so, once again, we've got this juxtaposition. Is Solomon this kind of guy? Or is Solomon Michael Corleone? I mean, this is what happens in The Godfather, y'all. Vito Corleone dies, and Michael consolidates power by wiping out Vito's enemies. And that's not original to Mario Puzo. That is what Solomon does after King David dies. So, in a real way, this is The Godfather Part 0, long before Francis Ford Coppola did anything else. So David's off the stage, and Solomon is off to a vicious, tough, bloody start. Now, you could argue if you're going to be a king in that era, you've got to consolidate power and do those kind of things. But it's a pretty vicious way that he does that. Okay, thoughts, comments so far? So. All right. Oh, yes, Kathleen, please. And you're muted there. So there you go.
Okay. I'm having a thought here. In Hebrews, where the writer talks about people from the Old Testament, references them, or these great people of faith or whatever. Excuse me. They don't ever, or any time in the New Testament, they don't really reference these bad things from the Old Testament. They talk about the faith that these people had, or the example they were, or, those good things. So it's kind of like, I don't know if there's mercy or, there's grace or whatever in the way that they reflect on the things of the past. Yeah, they weren't so good all the time, or they made mistakes, but, there's still examples in many ways to us, kind of thing. Anyway, that was just where my mind went.
Sure, and especially with King David, that is very much what they want us to see. I mean, David is still the quintessential king for Israel. I mean, Jesus is called Son of David for a reason. David is the role model. David is the one who messes up but repents and gets back on board.
Mhm.
So I think that certainly is a part of things. So good, good. Any other comments or thoughts? I can't see everybody, so unmute yourself and shout out.
Father Jim,
Yes.
this is Ann
Hi, Ann.
Ferguson.
Yeah, there you are now.
I see where Nathan has a role in this, the prophet,
Right.
because otherwise Bathsheba would not even have known.
Yeah, Nathan.
And he advised her what to do and how it was all going to play out.
Yes, yes. Nathan is certainly a power player here as well. And Nathan, we don't know just about, Nathan just kind of appears out of nowhere. We don't have any backstory about Nathan. He appears several times in Samuel, and now he's certainly an important figure here at the beginning of First Kings as well. So, palace intrigue is going on. There are plenty of BBC shows about various reigns of various kings with all kinds of advisors behind the scenes, and this is happening in the 900s BC, just like it happens at other times in the history of the world. Okay, well let's continue on here. Let's do the good part of Solomon here, and then we'll get to his tougher parts as well. So Solomon really he does have a glorious reign. Even Jesus, when Jesus is looking for to talk about the lilies of the field and how wonderful they are, even Solomon in all his glory, even Solomon in all his regalia was not dressed as these flowers are, and yet the flowers are going to be dead tomorrow. How much more will God take care of you? God gives the flowers its beauty. So Solomon is still, even in Jesus' time, the paragon of glory and wondrousness, and Israel at its peak, the Jewish people at their peak of opulence. So Solomon's glorious reign here. So at the beginning, Solomon starts out great. I mean, out of the chute, you think, okay, well, he's a little vicious, but he has to be. But chapter 3, one of the greatest stories about Solomon, a couple of the greatest stories about Solomon. First, Solomon prays to God. God, offers him whatever he wants, and Solomon prays for wisdom. He wants to be a wise king to rule the people, and God comes back and says, well, Solomon, you could have asked for riches, you could have asked for honor, but since you asked for wisdom, I'm going to give you wisdom and riches and honor. You're going to have the whole kingly package. I'm going to bless you because your heart is in the right place at this point. And then we get just this amazing story. This is where the kids' Bible, if the kids' Bibles are going to show one story about Solomon, this is it. It's a little traumatic if they draw the sword. But you've got the two women that each have a baby, and one of them dies at night, and they both claim the living baby as their own, and they come to Solomon to adjudicate this case. And his brilliant response, the story, he tells his soldier, get a sword out, split the baby in half, and give half to each one of these ladies if they can't agree on whose the baby is. And one lady says, yeah, do it, give me half a baby. And the other one says, no, give her the baby, let the baby live. And Solomon says, she's the mother, give her the baby. Of course, she wants the baby to live. Brilliant thing. Everybody marvels at how wise Solomon is at his wisdom here in deciding this case. So the quintessential story of the brilliance of Solomon. Great story. Then Solomon, there's a section about him, how he sets up political governance over this pretty vast territory that he's got, relatively vast in terms of the borders of Israel before and after. And they go through a list of what the territories are and who the governors are and what they are. So just for a map's sake, on this map, when David started as king in 1005, he was king of Judah, and then he added the kingdom of Israel 5-6 years later. But then he did conquests as a young king, and not all of these were conquered. Some of these were just vassal states, but the green and the yellow and the purple is kind of the extent of David's kingdom. And the Philistines were vassals and the Phoenicians were allies. And the description in the book is that Solomon's empire kind of followed these borders, the red boundary, so even further than his father David. All right, the map of Israel today, let's see if we can trace it. So it goes down the Jordan River, Golan Heights are here, but basically Israel goes down the Gulf of Aqaba and up to here and over here. So really, this part of Israel is the nation state of Israel today. So this territory of Solomon's is well over double, probably close to triple at least, what the nation state of Israel is over here today. So what we would call Syria, what we would call Jordan, part of Jordan, what we would call Lebanon up here as an ally. This is part of Solomon's orbit, even up into Syria, up into Iraq up here. This is a huge chunk of territory. Bob, I saw your hand go up there, and you're muted. Bob, you're on mute still. There you go.
Story of my life. Two things to think about. First, and we've got to realize that that Israel is about the size of Rhode Island. So Israel at its best is probably about the size of New Hampshire. It's not, or about the size, smaller than the Panhandle.
Yeah. I didn't flash that map up. I've showed that map before. Israel is about the width of Lubbock County, and then it expands to be about the width of two Texas South Plains counties, and then kind of narrows down again. And if you look at the very top of Israel, the top of Israel is about Slayton, even with Slayton, and the bottom of Israel is even with Del Rio. So kind of that slice of things. So it's a narrow country, and not huge. So probably a little bit bigger than Rhode Island today, but Connecticut and Rhode Island maybe. But so maybe adding, it is small. It's not Texas sized by any stretch of the imagination.
When I was a kid, they used to say Rhode Island. Okay. But I guess that was before the 6-Day War in the 1970s.
6-Day War, Gaza. My joke, when I first got out of seminary, I had 3 churches, and if you added the counties up, it was 4 Rhode Islands or 2 Delawares, or 0.8 Connecticut's. So I'd tell my classmates that they would marvel at the square mileage I had to cover. I had 75 members scattered over this huge chunk of Texas territory. So the way things roll out here, but much bigger territory. This is the apex. This is the historical apex for the Jewish people. Never before, never since have they had territory like this. And there are questions: did Solomon really go all the way to the Euphrates or not? Was that hyperbole? Was that literal geopolitical talk? Well, good question. You can argue that, but nevertheless, it's a big chunk of territory. And that's because guys down here in Egypt and the guys up here in Mesopotamia and Assyria at this point, and the Hittites up here, they've all shrunk in influence. And you've got kind of this one golden century where there's a real power vacuum in the Levant, and David and Solomon fill the vacuum, and they take over this area. All right. So also the glories of Solomon. Scripture talks about him writing 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. His dad was a songwriter as well. David's attributed with psalms, writing a number of the psalms, which are songs. And so Solomon, is this hyperbole? Is this literal? Well, either way, it's still impressive. Scholars today would say probably about a third of the core of the book of Proverbs is traceable back to Solomon. There's other wisdom contained in Solomon. And scholars will also say that probably not everything attributed to Solomon is from the pen of Solomon. You've got different books like the Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiastes. You've got Song of Songs or Song of Solomon. Are all those directly written by Solomon? Well, maybe some of those are later. Maybe some of the Proverbs are later, but there is at least a core that is attributable to Solomon pretty solidly. Most scholars would agree. And even if these are attributed to Solomon later, some of the other writings, that says a lot about who Solomon was, that later generations, if they're trying to write something wise, they will stick his name on it because he is the paragon of a wise teacher, a wise king, a wise person, a sage, all of those things. And so Solomon not only is the pinnacle of territory in Israel. He's also the pinnacle of the wisest figure in the history of the Jewish people. He has a huge wisdom reputation. All right. Solomon also engages in some lavish building projects. He builds a temple for God and also has a palace built for himself. There's a little bit of disagreement about where the palace is. The ruins of that are not extant. They've been covered over long since. And this is, even though his dad built a fairly decent palace in Jerusalem, Solomon is apparently got expensive enough taste that dad's palace is not enough for a king of his stature. And so he does build a larger palace, even though it's just one generation after dad builds his palace. So there's a lot of description about the temple. Solomon, uses his relationship with the king of Tyre, Hiram, who is attested to in non-biblical sources. They get cedar trees from Lebanon down. There's not, giant redwoods are not extant down here in Israel, but there are some big trees up in Lebanon, even a big cedar on the Lebanese flag still to this day. And so they bring down wood. It's a big building project. Lots of people are conscripted. And so huge building project of this temple in Jerusalem. Just want to say a few things about Jerusalem. So we talked about David's Jerusalem last time, and compared to Jesus's Jerusalem, David's Jerusalem was very small. But what's going to happen here is that David's Jerusalem is going to be more than doubled by son Solomon. So this is the Jerusalem that David captured, inherited, got by conquest of the Jebusites. And Solomon, to the same scale, takes it up the hill. So this chunk, this is Mount Moriah here. There are two mounts in what we call Jerusalem, Mount Zion, Mount Moriah. This is supposedly the place where Abraham tried to sacrifice Isaac. Unless you're Muslim, this is the place where Abraham tried to sacrifice his son Ishmael, different son in the Quran than in the Bible. But nevertheless, this city on this finger of land, Solomon just builds up the finger up to the top of the mountain that this finger is part of here, and places the temple kind of at the top of this hill, this mountain here. And at the time, it was a magnificent temple. So I showed this map last time. The yellow dots are Jerusalem's walls today, the walls of the old city, which are really Turkish and Crusader walls in some cases. But Jesus's Jerusalem didn't follow that same outline. And of course, David's Jerusalem is outside the old Turkish walls completely. David's Jerusalem was down here. So Solomon builds up this finger and builds up to this area that is part of what we call the Temple Mount today. And just, I've shown these slides before, but when we look at this Temple Mount in the city of Jerusalem in context, it's a little hard to get a grip on things. And so I did Google Maps at the same scale, and there's Jones Stadium, and here is St. Paul's on the plains next to the Temple Mount, just to give you a little sense of scale. Neither one of these things is equal to the Temple Mount in scale. There is one thing in Lubbock that is equal, so I cut that out too. Temple Mount's about the size of South Plains Mall. So it's a pretty good chunk of territory there. On it are two mosques, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. This actually is the important one. This is less important. This is the third holiest site in Islam after Mecca and Medina, which is why Jerusalem's politics are so dicey, because this is the third holiest Muslim site. This is the holiest Jewish area, even though it's got a Muslim shrine on top of it. Their Wailing Wall is right here. And so anyway, it's complicated stuff, but this is of course Jesus's time that the Temple Mount was this size. This is Herod's temple that was this size. The second temple, they call it the second temple, but it was a heavily remodeled temple. Solomon had the first temple. It was destroyed. They built a second temple in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. We get that later. We'll talk about it. But it was shabby compared to Solomon's temple. But Herod's temple and that temple of Ezra and Nehemiah is the same temple. They call both of those the second temple, but they completely gutted, remodeled, and increased the size tremendously. And so it's Herod's temple is really kind of a third temple, but they call it the second temple because they never stopped sacrificing. all the while they had this building project. The Herod's Temple was a grand edifice. Herod's Temple Mount, is the size of the Temple Mount today, follows the same outlines. Solomon's Temple is much smaller. Now it's 1,000 years or 900 years earlier. And so building technology, all that stuff, didn't have Roman building techniques, all of that stuff. So it's a smaller operation. So to scale, the temple in Jesus' time was probably about this size. And here's a picture of Solomon's temple about to the same scale. I tried to get them to the same scale. So it is smaller, about a third the height and half the length and width of Solomon's temple, of Herod's temple. But it's still, nevertheless, an impressive structure. Gold leaf all over the place inside. You've got the Holy of Holies. Solomon has had the Ark of the Covenant brought in and stashed there. You've got these big pillars. You've got giant ceremonial basins to wash. You've got a big altar to burn stuff on, offer sacrifice on. So it's not near as big as the temple in Jesus's time, but it still is a very impressive structure. And given the fact that it's 900 years earlier, it's impressive from that standpoint as well. The other thing too, Herod expanded the original Temple Mount. This is Herod's Temple Mount. This is the Temple Mount we see today. Back in the earlier stages of the temple, it was about this size. So much smaller. This gray area reflects what Solomon would have had. The blue area is what's there today. So that is more what we're looking at during Solomon's time. Something a much smaller Temple Mount. So really, almost the Temple Mount in Solomon's time was probably more like this, kind of almost the same size as this area here, this courtyard, but shaped probably a little bit differently. Most scholars think that the temple, the Holy of Holies of the temple, was where the Dome of the Rock is. There's some scholars that say, nope, it really is here. Some scholars say, nope, it was really there. Jewish rabbis say no good Jew and nobody else should go up on this mount because you might step on where the Holy of Holies was. So don't go up there. Well, the rabbis can say that, but people go up there anyway. And Christians, when I was there, Christians were allowed to go up on this Temple Mount and take off your shoes to go in the Alaska Mosque and in the Dome of the Rock. But you did what you're supposed to do to be good guests there. All right, so that's what we're talking about with Solomon's temple. It was not as glorious as later, but it was extremely impressive for 900 BC, 2,900 years ago. So First Kings also details Solomon's military might, his economic might. The trade is very impressive. And there's even the story of a queen coming all the way from Yemen, Sheba, the Queen of Sheba, the southwestern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. She comes and makes this pilgrimage to see Solomon and brings her wealth as well. Yemen, you've got gold, you've got frankincense and things like that down there, myrrh, and so it's a fancy schmancy place. And she makes this pilgrimage to see this great king Solomon. There are all kinds of later stories about them having liaison, romance. There are later stories that maybe she is the object of the Song of Solomon, and he's writing, a romantic, erotic love poem to the Queen of Sheba. That's all later conjecture. There's not direct biblical evidence for that, but she's an intriguing enough figure, and this is, it's pretty wild that one of the great queens of the area would come and make a pilgrimage to see this great king. So it again is showing how powerful, how opulent, how wonderful Solomon's reign is. Okay. So far, so good. Questions about that before we go off the cliff? Because we're going to hit chapter 11, and we do have this cliff here. So chapter 11 is Solomon's apostasy and his death. So Solomon's got so much going for him. What trips him up? Well, as far as the Deuteronomic historian is concerned, it's the women in his life. They talk about 700 wives and 300 concubines, and a lot of them are foreign princesses. And so when the foreign princesses come, husband wants to make them comfortable, and so he starts building shrines and temples for all of their pagan gods. And he also starts worshiping occasionally with the wives to keep them happy. And so this is, as far as the Deuteronomic historian is concerned, it's all these women and all these foreign women and all of the gods that they bring in that trips Solomon up. And in chapter 11, it says point blank that Solomon's heart turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel. His heart turned to worshiping all of these other gods. As we said, though, or hold that thought for a sec, Jim. Also in chapter 11, it talks about things falling apart politically. There's some rebellion from some of the client states, Moab and things, Edom. There's rebellion. Jeroboam starts to mount a rebellion, and he runs off and leaves when Solomon counterattacks. But he'll be waiting in the wings for Solomon to die, and he'll come back, and he'll later rule the northern kingdom after the Civil War. And so things are starting to deteriorate and disintegrate. The guy who will be the rival king is already waiting in the wings. And God says point blank, your descendants will not be able to keep this kingdom intact because they haven't been faithful. They're not going to be faithful. You haven't been faithful. And so Solomon eventually dies. He is able to kind of keep his kingdom, even though it's starting to fall apart, but it's going to just disintegrate after his death. And we'll get to Rehoboam later. Rehoboam is not a good king. We'll get to him next time. So this is falling apart, and Solomon ends badly, ends by turning away from the God of Israel. Now the question again we brought up is, are there dips or is there a cliff? And I want to address that. I am of the dips school of thought. I find those arguments convincing. The scholars that study this, they go back all the way to chapter 3 and say, if you look at chapter 3 carefully, it says initially Solomon loved the Lord and he walked in the way, the statutes of his father David. But already in chapter 3, right at the beginning of Solomon's reign, it puts this little mention here that things maybe aren't going to be going great. Only Solomon also sacrificed and offered incense at the high places. Well, what are the high places? Well, the high places are places where pagan gods are worshipped, Canaanite gods are worshipped. And so even in chapter 3, we don't have to wait till chapter 11, where we're starting to get some early intimations. Solomon loves God, except he's also occasionally worshiping at these other shrines for these other gods as well. So things are already, look out, y'all. Things are not going to go well for Solomon. There's scholars also point to chapter 8, the wonderful long prayer. Solomon builds this glorious temple for the God of Israel. You think he's being very, very faithful to God. He is in some ways. It's in God's honor. But they point out, if you look at the prayer, 5 times in the prayer, Solomon talks about how he is the one who has built this temple for God. And as one scholar says, Solomon's prayer at some levels about God, God, God. Then another level it's also about me, 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 me. And so, Solomon doing this for the glory of Yahweh, or is Solomon doing this for the glory of Solomon, or some combination thereof? And how do you strike the balance? Well, there's some me, me, me glory of Solomon in here as well. Probably one of the biggest things here also is there were some warnings back in the book of Samuel. The prophet Samuel himself warned the people when they were wanting a king. If you get a king, these are the things the king will do to you. And Solomon does all those bad things that Samuel prophesied. The book of Kings describes some of these things. Solomon's dining room goes through a huge amount of produce a day. They go through 30 cattle and 100 sheep a day. Now that could be exaggerated, but it's a culture where most folks eat meat on holidays and on special occasions. You don't eat meat daily in your diet if you're the average guy. And so for a palace to go through that kind of 30 cattle and 100 sheep a day, that much beef and mutton, that's very conspicuous consumption. Hugely conspicuous consumption. Also, Samuel warned that he would draft your kids, not only take your wealth, but draft your kids, and talks about Solomon drafting 180,000 of his citizens to work on building his palace and building the temple for God. Again, this could be an exaggerated number, a little bit of hyperbole, but it's still a huge number, no matter how you slice it. But if you look at these dips, another scholar has really gone into detail comparing and contrasting. Look at what Deuteronomy says. He says basically compared to 1 Kings, and this is a very compelling argument, I think. Book of Deuteronomy, remember, is from the same school of thought as First Kings. They're both part of the Deuteronomic school. In First Kings is part of the Deuteronomic history. And so what does Deuteronomy say about kings? There's a wonderful set of juxtapositions. So in Deuteronomy, Moses says, if you set over you a king that God will choose for you, the king must behave certain ways. For one thing, the king must not acquire many horses. He doesn't need to have a huge standing army with all these horses. What does First Kings say? 1,400 chariots, 12,000 horses is what Solomon amassed. And Solomon's not following the Deuteronomy playbook. Moses tells the people in Deuteronomy, a king shouldn't have many wives for himself or else his heart will turn away. Solomon, 700 wives, 300 concubines, and his heart certainly does turn away. Deuteronomy, the king shouldn't accumulate much silver or gold in great quantity. Well, First Kings talks about the ridiculous amount of gold and silver Solomon amasses. In fact, so much that he is able to drink out of golden cups only, because he doesn't need to have any silver on his table. He can drink of mugs of chalices of pure gold. So again, Solomon fails from the standpoint of Deuteronomy. So probably the better graph really is this. And Solomon is chugging along at a fairly high level, but there are already intimations, and maybe some of these canyons need to be a little bit lower before Solomon eventually Thelma and Louise is right over the edge of the cliff and goes totally apostate. So in all of Scripture, Solomon is the character with the biggest spiritual flame out. There is nobody else that is at such a high level that really flames out completely. And if you look at Deuteronomy compared to First Kings, the Deuteronomic history, Solomon gets an F as a king. He does not do what kings are supposed to do, and he very much does what kings are not supposed to do. So, Solomon, Solomon's reign, glorious, awful, wonderful, hideous. That makes him so complex. And I've these questions: is he a wise sage or a fool who made horrible choices? And the answer is yes. Does he love God or does he turn away from God? Yes. Great leader, greedy tyrant? Yes. Yes to all those things. Those are all aspects of Solomon. So to summarize Solomon, other kings, David stuck with God. Other kings stick with God, a few of them, despite having some ups and downs throughout their reigns. Some kings never have a great relationship with God. They start badly, they end badly. And there are a bunch of those we'll see in the coming sections. But nobody else starts as well as Solomon does and just goes down the tubes, so completely turning his back on God. And so as far as the Deuteronomic historian goes, hold on just a second, Bob. Solomon is the worst of the worst as far as the pinnacle down to the depths. And so they really want us to see Solomon as a warning of what you don't do as king. So, Bob, go ahead.
And I guess that's part of I guess a lot of the summary of the chapter is that, this is written by historians after the fact and after the destruction of Solomon's temple, for that matter.
Right.
I find it.
Well, the final editions are after the destruction of Solomon's temple. The earliest chunks of Deuteronomic history are before Solomon's temple is destroyed. Yeah. But go ahead.
I find it. I don't know how to say. It's almost not a useful comment, but Solomon had direct. I think he may be the last person in the Bible prior to Jesus that had direct knowledge, direct relationship with God, a personal relationship with God, and yet he still turned away. Yet he still let himself be swayed. And he's having conversations with God.
Yeah, of the kings, he's one of the last that does that. I'd have to really look at Josiah. The prophets will pick up that role actually as kings keep going. Remember last week I said the prophets will be a check and balance on kings, and they'll be the ones who will say, "Thus says the Lord." They're the ones getting messages from God. But the kings much less so. You're certainly correct about that. Yeah, I mean, how could you? It is mind-boggling in some ways. How could you turn your back on God when God has given you so much and direct contact and all that? And so he's a tragic figure in Scripture. There's no doubt. Other comments or questions or thoughts?
Jim, I have a question.
Yeah.
This is Kathleen. I'm reading in Ecclesiastes, and the commentary in my Bible notes that Ecclesiastes, Solomon was using more of his wisdom or man's wisdom, and not so much the wisdom of God that God has given him. And Ecclesiastes, to me, it's kind of hard to read because it's so much, life is vain. You live and you die, and you don't even take it with you, just all this stuff. But my question, when do they think he wrote Ecclesiastes? I mean, just on one of his too many wives today?
Yeah, there are all kinds of opinions about Ecclesiastes. Some will posit Solomon as the author of that, some will not. But
Mhm.
if you posit Solomon as the author of that, God doesn't appear in Ecclesiastes very much at all. And as you
Mhm.
say, it's a bitter book. All these things I've acquired are vain and empty.
Mhm.
Paper and Fire is John Mellencamp's song that is based on Ecclesiastes. It's just a horrible thing. And so if you're going to have Solomonic authorship of Ecclesiastes, it's probably later in his reign, most people would say,
Mhm.
that think he had something to do with it. Others would say, it's written by a later wise person attributing to Solomon. But if it is Solomonic, it does come later in his reign, most likely, from that standpoint.
I mean, there are some good things he
Ecclesiastes
talks
is
about.
one of the most depressing books in the Old
Yeah.
Testament. There's no doubt.
Well, like he talks about, working really hard and earning your money, or you call it money, but that you should enjoy that you should enjoy your earnings. You should enjoy the fruit of your labor. You should, so I'm finding a few little jewels that I don't remember seeing before, that kind of encourage me that, yeah, this is, enjoy what you have while you have it kind of thing. And anyway,
But it's also a dark one to enjoy it now
yes,
because you ain't gonna have it later,
yes.
and eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow we die.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
is kind of part
Right.
of Ecclesiastes. Yeah,
Very dark.
yeah. And God hardly is mentioned at all in that book. It's
Right.
one of
Right.
the least divine books as far as talking about God. Any other thoughts or questions here? Bless you, Jacob. Sneezing here. All right. Well, good deal. Well, we'll pick up with things really falling apart next week. Solomon's son Rehoboam takes all the worst aspects of his father, and everything falls apart under his reign. Civil war. We'll get to all that. It's a tough part of Israel's history next week. But good to see you all, Abby. Hope your COVID recovery and quarantine goes okay with your family, and don't kill each other. Cooped up together. So. All right, y'all. Well, take care, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you, Jim.
You bet.